Recording. Well, greetings everybody. I hesitate to say good morning because we are all over the world. Speaking here from my base in the UK, and our speaker today. Welcome, David, to you in Sydney. Thank you for joining us for Conscious Cafe Global. Welcome. This is, I think this is our fifth global cafe. We've had the cafes online in these times where our meetings moved online. We've had them with Nick Haynes. We had talking about large cycles of time. Lynn McTaggart talked to us about the power of 8 and the power of intention. We had Denise Quinlan talk about how we work a practical workshop talking about how we improve our profile online through LinkedIn. And lastly, we had Richard Barrett from the Barrett Value Centre talking about levels of consciousness. So all of those events were recorded and they're on the Conscious Cafe YouTube channel. We'll record today's as well. I just want to start off by introducing Conscious Cafe. Conscious Cafe is something that started 9 years ago. In fact, we had the 9th birthday on Saturday, celebrating 9 years since Judy Piatkas founded it at her base in London. And she started it after retiring away from her publishing company. And if you've got any mind, body, spirit books, I bet you they'll have the P logo on the spine. Judy was a leading publisher in that field and other fields too. And so she started Conscious Cafe as a place for community and conversation. And many of us have loved going to those events. I travel down from Yorkshire to go to them. And so other cafes, communities started in other towns, and currently we have Conscious Cafe in New Forest, Newbury, Canterbury, Oundle, St Albans, Skipton in the north where I'm based. I've been running that for 3 years now. And do actually add in the chat if you are from one of those communities, and you certainly don't need to be, but it's good when we look at the chat later to see, you know, whether you're part of one of these communities. And we also now overseas, Debbie has a cafe in France and Geneva. Hannah is here from Singapore, and our latest cafes are in Rome and Vancouver. And as we said earlier, with the time zone, we're not likely to be welcoming anybody from Vancouver this morning, so they'll probably be watching the recording. We just to give you an alert on future events, we have one, I believe, next week. Wendy, who's actually here on the call, Wendy Ehrlich, is going to talk about the power of gratitude. That's going to be a fantastic subject next week. And then a few weeks later, on July the 14th, Krista McKinnon, I don't think she's with us today. Krista McKinnon, who is a psychologist and medicine woman, is going to talk about transformation in a crisis. It's kind of the subject we're talking about today, however, from a completely different angle. So all of these are great topics that have been supporting us and giving us, because today is more of a content presentation and less a community call. Each of the groups, I joined Anne's group in the New Forest on Monday. Wonderful conversation about how we are emerging out into the space after lockdown, and I'll be hosting an event similar to that next week for Skipton, all of them online. We do love it when we can get together and talk, but we can certainly talk online in these community meetings. So now I want to introduce today's event. David's going to talk for about 30-40 minutes or so, give a presentation, and then we have some space and we can ask questions. And we've got the chat here where you can put your questions, and we'll see how that works. And the title of today's presentation is Igniting an Inner Change Revolution with Conscious Collaboration. And as, excuse me, as David pointed out to me, these are really powerful words, each one rich and impactful in its own right, you know, igniting, revolution, inner change, conscious and collaboration. This is what he's going to kind of drill into today. And the topic really addresses the level and scale of change that we're all experiencing individually and globally at this time. And we're always going through change. You can have a change conversation any moment in time, but really today, in these times, it's expanded. And what David's talking about is how our capacities need to be changed in order for us to cope with this change. So he's talking about an upgrade. So he's going to bring in neuroscience He's going to talk about how we need to up our game because the solutions to the problems that we have do not exist now. Whereas before we might be looking around for who's got the answer. They don't seem to exist anymore. And so it's going to, as he points out, require us to increase our level of awareness and our capacities for collaboration because individually we don't have the answers. And this is all about taking us through into the new normal because things will never go back to as they were before. So let me just, before David starts, let me introduce Dr. David Paul. I've known David for about 15 years, and when I first met him in Sydney at a leadership event, I was immediately impressed that his specialism was complex change. Just thought, wow, that's amazing. And then 15 years later, boy, do we need those solutions for complexity, excuse me. That's all apply. So David, one of the world leaders specializing in complex change, he is passionate about the psychology of leadership. And in the time that I've known him, I've interviewed him many times for my feminine leadership blog, talking about women leaders, particularly when I was in Sydney, when Julia Gillard, they had a female prime minister there. And David has worked with senior leaders, CEOs, heads of charities, heads of government, and a lot of those were women. And he was always giving me insights to how leadership was changing and the contribution of women and the contribution of feminine energy in leadership. David's often called on to work in complex scenario like the Beijing Olympics. Olympics, you can imagine, involving every country in the world, is itself, complex without having anything unusual happen about it. And he is also an adult educator, teaching nearly 27,000 leaders in executive MBAs throughout in Europe and also throughout the Far East. He's particularly works with leaders who are facing perfect storms of change. Maybe I put that in the write-up. So that is where everything comes at you, and it really calls for a special kind of leader. What David and I were talking about is like finding the super skills, the superhero within all of us, and this is what we have to find now. And lastly, David co-authored a book called Life and Work in 2003. Forgot to bring it here to the screen to show you. And he was years ahead of his time in outlining what companies and organizations would need to do to be able to run sustainably in the future, particularly the care of people. And we really can see that now with things have shifted. So David, I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to you. I'm going to hand over to you. And I think in order for me to do that, I'm going to make you the host so that you can do your presentation. In fact, why don't we all give David a silent applause and wave and greetings. There you go, warm applause. Make host. Okay, over to you, David. I am here if you need me. We can see you.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Can see it from here, yep. Still yep. Recording, yeah, and we can hear you. Fantastic.
Okay. Let me... Great. Well, thank you to each and every one of you for coming today. I really appreciate the fact that you took the time to come, but more importantly, I salute the highest part of you for wanting to come and participate and learn something, I hope, by the end of this presentation. So thank you, Gina, for your kind words. I always feel weird when people talk about me. I always say, just introduce me as David and let's see what happens. But that's very kind of you. And yes, I can't believe it's 15 years ago that we actually met. And I'll have to mention that Desley is also from Sydney, and she was actually at that book launch. She's the one who has a dog in her lap. So, so nice to see you, Desley. So I when Gina and Judy asked me to do this, I spent a lot of time thinking, what will I share in terms of complexity, in terms of change? And I probably read this presentation about 12 times from scratch, every time. And then finally, while meditating one day, it just fell into place. And it was all about talking about something new, as well as something familiar. So I'm hoping that even though a lot of it, you might go, yeah, I remember, I know, I've read, I've seen, I've heard. I hope that it will ignite something inside you as you hear some of the things that I have to share. So you will see in the top right-hand corner, I've got 4 words: ignite, learn, transform, and collaborate. And if we could do those 4 things at this particular moment in time, we are going to start an incredible change revolution. So let me explain what I mean with those 4 words. And by the way, the picture that you see is actually called a fire seed. And if you've ever seen a fire seed, it can jump and ignite major catastrophic fires. But obviously we want to look at how we can use it to do positive things with that kind of ignition. So it's called a fire seed. And quite some time ago, there was a conference called Ignite Your Fire Seeds for Renewal. And that renewal is what we've had for the last 5 months, really. So I'm hoping that some of you have managed to get a break. And those of you who've been working long hours, I hope that you will create some space and time for you. So let me begin by sharing what my challenge is to us all, including myself. And that is, let the fire of your deep inner self burn brightly as new and promising horizons are opening up. So that's my challenge for all of us, including myself. So there are some new horizons that are coming up, and they have never been here before, ever in history. And we have the chance to do something about it. But to take or grab those opportunities, those new horizons, you have to let your inner self burn brightly. So most of you would have been drowning in data and science from the pandemic. But it's actually an unprecedented pandemic. I've listened to several experts. When I say several, I'm talking about 120, 130 experts talk about why this particular pandemic is actually different to every single one previously. And that is because it's actually presented a global challenge. And that is how to isolate every single person beyond our borders. So it's not just one country or 2 countries or a dozen countries or even a continent. It's actually been a global challenge. So the other challenge has been, what do we do with all these people who are in isolation? How do we actually do that? Ebola, for example, if you remember that, it was contained to pretty much one continent, which was Africa. And countries started to fight with each other saying, you know, why did Sierra Leone not close their schools, for example, when we have to close our schools? So those kinds of things were raging, but we didn't hear about them. But this one, we've heard so much about it and about pretty much every single country. The second thing is that, excuse me, here we go, is that it is an opportunity for leaders. So most of you, I hope, would have found some of the leaders quite amusing in some of the things that they've said. over the last number of months, which I'll talk about. But really, you will also know, has this particular challenge, this global challenge, have you seen any great leaders? Have you seen, can you name, say, 3 or 4 great leaders that you admire as a result of this pandemic? World War II, we could rattle off a number of leaders, which was the last biggest kind of global event. But what about now? What are some global leaders that you can say, gosh, I really, really admire them? The other thing is that we've actually had really fragile systems. So, for example, medical. A lot of hospitals around the world had no idea how to cope with the number of cases that they were experiencing. Tourism, as you would all know, all aspects of tourism has been affected. Hospitality, severely affected and severely impacted. In fact, it's forced a lot of hospitality sectors to close down. Leisure, parks were closed for a long period of time, for example. Sport, all the big events, Tokyo Olympics, which are supposed to be taking place this year, has been postponed to next year. But even then, they're already saying that it will be a much scaled down event, as I'm talking to some of the people dealing with the Olympics there. Education, of course, they supposedly were prepared for this, but not on this scale, because a lot of education has been online, but not at this level, not at this depth, and not at this scale. The arts, of course, theatres, for instance, films, industry, all to do with anything to do with arts and entertainment, they've been severely affected. So these are fragile systems, and nobody could have predicted the scale of our fragility. In fact, we actually thought we were a bit like the Titanic, unsinkable. Then we've had some good things, such as technology, the idea of scaling up. So, for instance, I was asked to give a guest lecture to a class a number of weeks ago. And I was told that there'll be probably about 200 students from different parts of Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and it ended up being almost 3,500 students wanting to look at the lecture was about change. So it was, again, they didn't have the capacity to scale up to that level. I don't know if any of you have access to telemedic, in other words, access to a healthcare professional, having your diagnosis through the screen online. What was your experience as a result of consulting a telemedic? Then there's obviously digital health, and there's a whole range of other areas that technology has scaled up. People who've never heard of Zoom, for example, have become experts in Zoom. Then there's Microsoft Teams, and there's a whole range of other things as well. So technology has scaled up. There's a greater embracing of the new G5 technology, which has been very, very interesting, because up to this point in time, most telecommunications companies had real marketing issues about introducing G5 technology, whereas now it's just almost seamless. People are just saying, when can I have it? So technology has scaling up, and it's going to be unprecedented in this next decade. So another one, those of you who are into technology would be aware that already they are dealing with or introducing holographic images. So rather than looking at video of a person, you'll actually see a hologram. And they're playing with technology on how to introduce that into the workplace. Research, which has been amazing, because for the first time, again in history, companies which have normally been competitors have actually been collaborating to find a vaccine. So that's been absolutely amazing, because normally most organizations, companies, pharmaceuticals usually don't share their research. So here's another way of the way that this pandemic has changed the way companies have behaved and are behaving. Then there is the radical forced change. Some of you might have seen pictures of CEOs taking their garbage out because they weren't allowed to have anyone come into their houses or into their apartment buildings, or clearing the garbage from their streets. So there's some very fun pictures of CEOs taking their own garbage out, and quite fun to actually see that they were willing to do that because no one else could do it. And another one that is most interesting is the global debt. Where is all this money coming from? And how are governments funding this kind of level of support? So that's going to have an interesting effect further down this decade as we look at some of these challenges. So I put these up as the biggest highlight kind of challenges that we're facing and will continue to face. Those of you who are aware, you will know that we've had 3 COVID viruses there, and there are actually 6 in the family. So I'm very intrigued to see will we experience the other 3. So we've had SARS, MERS, and COVID-19. So we've got another 3 to go, which is part of the same family. So wonder if that will impact the world yet again. So I wonder if your curiosity, like mine, is about what's happened to the internet. How many users are using the internet? So this is what happened in April 2020 in terms of billions. So you will see in terms of the 4 blue columns, you will see that in terms of active internet users, there have been over 4.5 billion active internet users. Unique mobile internet users, there have been 4.2 billion. Social media users, 3.8. And then active mobile social media has been 3.7. So this was in April 2020. So I would like to know what happened in June, if that actually spiked even higher. So the internet penetration, in terms of the planet as a whole, Northern Europe ranks number 1 with a 95% of internet penetration. So as a block, that's the highest. But as a countries, it'll be India, China, America that has the greatest numbers of internet penetration. So countries with the 99% of internet penetration, I wonder if you can have a guess what maybe 2 countries might be with the 99 internet penetration. This surprised me. Iceland, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, and Bahrain. Each of those countries have a 99% of internet penetration. So it's very, very interesting what the digital world is actually doing, how far it's penetrated. And overall, though, it's about globally, it's about 52% penetration. So we still got about 48% of the world that does not have the level of sophistication of internet penetration that we do today. So I hope that's kind of fun, because it just goes to show that this is going to increase more and more and more as companies allow more people to work from home. So this is going to be very, very interesting. So what are the business lessons that we could learn? And those of you who have friends, family, loved ones, acquaintances, what kind of challenges are they facing? And globally, businesses are facing, number one, this is actually a human crisis. It's not a technological crisis. It's not a process crisis. It's not an IT crisis. It's purely a human crisis. And this is interesting because this crisis has raised a number of issues. And I don't want to give it away, but maybe when we have our chat further down the track, you might allude to, or you might know some of the crises that people are experiencing. But in terms of business, they've never experienced a human crisis like this before. So the second thing they're facing is agility. How can we deliver the very best of our products and services in this crisis? So despite the change, how can we still deliver what we do? So obviously, banks have been doing online banking for decades now, but think of other sectors and how they are dealing with this crisis in terms of changing. So some of you might have known that your favorite cafe or your favorite restaurant have learned to adapt and then become almost like a takeaway cafe or restaurant. The third thing was, in terms of big business lessons, is decision making. So this is unprecedented because leaders and managers have had to adapt constantly to changing situations. This has never happened before. So they either had to upscale or downscale, make decisions on the fly because they haven't had time to consult with a whole range of people, and then inform others of the decision that they've made. And in some cases, they made bad decisions, poor decisions. And in some cases, decisions have been delayed for weeks instead of just taking a few days or a few hours because of the way that they communicate. In terms of people, how they've been juggling responsibilities. So for the first time, people had to learn how to juggle their responsibilities as well as their accountabilities. So they've got responsibilities at home, but how can they be accountable to their teams, their colleagues, their bosses, their leaders in terms of deliverables? How do they deal with this level of challenge in terms of being accountable? And in some companies, they actually had to track literally how they were spending 15-minute segments of an hour, for example. What did you do in the last 15 minutes? What did you accomplish in the last hour? A lot of companies have introduced that kind of screening and that kind of tracking. And obviously, in the midst of all of this, you've got a whole range of things happening at home. Whether it's children at home, whether it's pets at home, whether it's, if you live in an apartment building, for example, how do you deal with all the noise? If you're living in a community, how do you deal with all the interruptions? What about the doorbell ringing constantly? Sometimes it's for you, sometimes it's not. So a whole lot of responsibilities have come into play. And the fifth one is all about learning. So not just learning online, which we've known a lot about, but it's about remote and virtual teams. How do we help them learn? How do we help them grow? And the other aspect is communication. We use that word so much, but for the first time, people had to learn how to communicate more efficiently, more effectively, because they could not, in the past, they couldn't go to the person and say, this is what I meant to say, or this is what I are meant in the meeting. Now it has to be so clear because everything is tracked. And people can now say, well, you said in that meeting, and here are the minutes for the meeting. Here's the video of that meeting. Here is the transcript of that dialogue that we had. So completely different way of dealing with communication as a result of this pandemic. Mental health. This has become one of the biggest challenges for organizations. For the first time, people have actually admitted, I'm stressed, I'm pressured, I've got too much on my plate, I can't deal with all the things that you're asking me to do. And it sparked a whole range of other kind of challenges and problems. If we have time, I might go into those. And while some people had a break from work, a lot of people have actually been working longer hours. I've spoken to at least 150 to about 180 people personally who have been working 12, 13, 14-hour days because there's no boundaries anymore. Because bosses have said, you're at home, I'll just send you that email and ask for that update, even though it's 9 o'clock at night. If a boss is still awake at 1 or 2 in the morning thinking about things, they'll fire off emails. So that 9 to 5 or 8:30 to 5:30 kind of time working hours have gone out the window as a result of people working from home. So what are the personal lessons that we could learn? And some of these lessons are coming from all around the world, which is very, very interesting, because the first one is the importance of interconnectedness. So rather than being isolated, people are actually recognizing, I miss you. I miss our banter. I miss the way we used to talk. I miss the way we used to bump into each other. I miss the fact that I don't see colleagues. I can't have those water cooler conversations. We used to say, let's catch up next week, but now you can't. You really can't catch up next week. And if you do catch up, you've got to keep your social distance. So that interconnectedness has become absolutely critical. And those who are extroverted are finding it even more difficult. And there's a spike in depression amongst extroverts, which is interesting. This notion of inner resilience, which is all to do with, can I bounce back after the fact that I've been isolated? Can I come back to a higher level of enthusiasm as a result of the challenges I've been facing? So inner resilience, again, a word that we haven't heard very much, but we heard of the word resilience, but inner resilience is becoming a new topic of discussion, which then links to this notion of well-being, which is how well have people been taking care of themselves. So one of the studies that have been done at this moment in time is looking at how big are your mood swings as a result of being at home? Do you have greater mood swings compared to when you were at work or when you were doing work? Or has it been harder? So well-being in terms of the way you feel, the way you deal with your emotions, the way you deal with what's happening inside your head has become a big subject of learning as a result of this pandemic. Mindset. So mindset is all to do with how do you approach a task, which in the past, because you're working, you come home, you focus on the task and you get it done because you've only got a finite amount of time. Whereas now, some people have had a more challenging mindset because they'll say, oh, I'll do that tomorrow because I'm at home. So mindset has been an interesting study because people have both positive and negative benefits of mindset. And I'll go a little bit into that further down in the presentation. The other one is habits. so people have had to change the way they shopped, for instance. So they've had to get deliveries or trust local farmers or local produce makers in terms of food. So shopping has been a very interesting revelation for a lot of people, because if you go into shops in most places, not only do they have the social distancing spacing, but also people are getting quite fearful of how close somebody else is to them. And so, in fact, I saw a 35-year-old, and the reason I know they're 35 is because I actually asked them after this interaction. They had a hula hoop in the shopping center, and I said, why do you have a hula hoop? So they said, so you don't come too close to me. So it's actually perfectly spaced at 2 meters. So, and I said, so what do you do? He said, and that person said, I'm a corporate banker. So interesting changes in people's behavior. Travel, of course, your favorite place to travel, or your favorite go-to place. International travel is out of the question, but travel has had to change the way people thought about it. And dropping in to see each other as well, that's had to change. In fact, a lot of people I've seen have been waving to each other from the street because they can't enter the space because the person is slightly older, and therefore they can't risk going in there. So dropping in has changed. So meeting you at the local cafe, local restaurant has changed completely. And this idea of fear, I don't know about where you are, but in Australia for quite a while we had toilet paper shortages. And now we have the opposite problem where toilet companies can't move their toilet paper because they've got too much. So, so for months we've literally had no toilet paper on our shelves. So again, how fear changes. In fact, our Prime Minister actually went on national television and said, please stop buying toilet paper. There's plenty for everybody. So the moment, though, you stop accepting challenges is the moment you stop moving forward. So how can we learn from these lessons, and how can we actually move forward? So it's a new era that we're actually facing. So number one, I'm going to ask you to make a note of this, and that is accept a challenge much more quickly than you used to. So this pandemic has taught everybody, especially leaders, that they need to act faster. So compared to what Donald Trump has said, instead of accepting a challenge much faster, he said on January 22nd, we have it totally under control. It's going to be just fine. And on February 26th, when you have 15 people, it's going to be down to close to zero. And that's a pretty good job we've done. So this is a global leader talking about how well the leadership have performed. And you can see that it is now the #1 country in terms of cases and losses of life. The second thing is taking some positive action. By us, each one of us need to, whatever that task is, after or post-COVID, I should say, we need to take some positive action, especially about the things that we find a challenge. And the third thing, we've got to reach out and break some of the barriers that this pandemic has caused, is greater collaboration. In other words, we need to reach across and build some bridges, because together we build a far greater defense. And the reason why governments around the world can take credit is not because of what they've done, it's because of what we've done. The fact that we've actually been really good citizens in terms of cooperating and complying and actually enforcing the rules of this particular pandemic. And that's the only reason why it's been such a success. So we need to collaborate and work together more. So a lot of you I'm guessing, know a little bit about neuroscience. So let me just slightly or very briefly touch on some aspects of neuroscience. The very first thing is your prefrontal cortex. So if you put your hand, see if you can follow me, just above your eyebrows. So make a straight line from your little finger to your wrist. So just put it just above your eyebrows. Don't touch your eyebrows, just above it. Close your eyes and see if you can feel a protruding bone in the soft, fleshy part of your palm. It should be a bone that's slightly protruding. So see if you can feel that bone. And where your ring finger is, or your middle finger might be, see if you can feel another protruding bone. So if you can feel those two bones, so say to yourself, this is my prefrontal cortex. Okay, this is my prefrontal cortex. And also say to yourself, this is my executive command center. So say to yourself, this is my executive command center. So put your hand down. So what you've just touched is really the core of the part of your brain that makes all your linear, logical thoughts. It thinks in straight lines. It controls your professional thinking. And it makes all your executive decisions for you. So that's the part of the brain that's sitting just in front of your forehead. And the reason why you wear a seatbelt is to protect this part of your brain. Okay, that's the only reason why you wear a seatbelt. Because if you damage this part of your brain, you will have a complete change in personality. So in terms of the pandemic, this particular part of the brain, because we're are not in formal workspaces, it's actually damped down quite a bit. In other words, it doesn't think at the same level as it used to think. So it kind of wanders a lot, it meanders a lot, it kind of gets lost in doing all sorts of different things. It starts a task and never finishes it, for example, because it's doing so many things, meandering, exploring, because it hasn't got the discipline of doing what it's supposed to do that it normally does from, say, 9:30 to 5:30 in a formal workspace. The other thing that this particular pandemic has done is rewired what's called established neural pathways. So, for example, a lot of routines that you would normally do because of working have gone out the window. So your brain had to rewire itself to do things differently. For instance, just getting out of bed in the morning, a lot of people have said the wake-up time has changed for the majority of people. So this is one thing that the pandemic has done, and it's also enabled people to become highly creative. So when you become creative, you will see on this picture at the top of the screen, all these beautiful colored lights. They look like Christmas lights, but they're actually neurons in your brain all lighting up. They're getting really excited because you're becoming creative about the way you're doing things. By the way, if you're not creative, that picture would look completely black. Okay, there's no lights on at all. Okay, so that's scary. You don't want to do that. Strengthening partnerships. So one of the things that you need to do, especially post COVID-19, is build and strengthen partnerships. So even people that you don't know but you think might be interesting, go ahead and bridge the gap between the two of you and just say something like, you know, I find your work or what you said or what you wrote interesting, if it's on social media. See if you can just build a bridge to those kinds of people, because this is what creativity does, is enables you to build partnerships, enables your brain to grow. And the whole idea of our existence is expanding our brain, growing our brain. So I'm going to talk about a couple of practical things about neuroscience, and then I'll open it up for all of us to have a chat. The first one is find an area you wish to change or an area which you want to grow in. Just focus on one thing. So don't pick like 10, just find one. Find an area in which you wish to change. It might be, say, giving up a habit or gaining a new habit. It might be giving up something that you don't like, or it might be saying, I admire that person for what they do, let me try it. So whatever it is, find something that you wish to change or you wish to grow in your particular life. I've just got a couple of people saying they're in the waiting room, so I'm just letting them in. So what you want to do is once you find that area, focus your executive brain that we just touched, get it to do the work for you. So get it to actually focus on what you want to do as a result of this one area that you wish to change or grow in. So the way to do that is to plan that change or plan that growth. So whatever it is, break it down and focus on one tiny part of it. So imagine if you have a particular part of the house that you haven't cleaned for a long time and you've been putting it off, or something that you need to clear out. So don't do the whole thing at once. Just plan the fact that you're going to do that particular space and break that space up into 4 quadrants and focus on one quadrant at a time. So focus on it. Now, deal with any blockages that your brain might bring up, because this is going to be really, really helpful, because if you allow the blockage to be your block, then what your brain does is that it will strengthen that particular neural pathway and it will always bring up that blockage for you. So to deal with blockages, if you can't do it on your own, seek some help, find a learning partner, or find a group. And especially in this pandemic, there are lots of people wanting to help you do that absolutely for free. So find somebody. All you have to do is just pick up your fingers, type on the keyboard, and you will find a learning partner or a whole group who'd want to help you. Okay, so it takes a little bit of effort, but it's worth it to deal with that blockage. The second thing you want to do is to slow your mind down. So rather than letting it control you, you want to control it. In other words, don't let the mind bring up what if and what about, and a whole range of other excuses that it will come up with for you not to do it. So control it, master it. It's a really, really good way to practice some sort of meditation or mindfulness practice every day, because that's one way to learn to control and master your mind. It's a very simple thing to do, but the idea is to actually do it every day. So I'm going to give you 5 very simple things that you could use every day, whether it's at home, at work, with friends or family. I'm going to ask you to practice these things. So we talked about that inner revolution. So this is the 5 things I'd like you to do. And this is using the neuroscience of your brain to actually make it happen. So the number 1 is become acutely self-aware. So ignite a real curiosity inside you to understand, why are you in this mood? Why do you feel this? Why is this emotion so strong about this particular instance, this event, this person? Understand what drives you or what demotivates you. So these are all things that you want to be acutely aware of. And the key word here is actually acute. So not just vaguely being aware of it, because the brain loves vagueness. Be really strict about, why is this happening? What is causing it? And what do I do about it? So ignite a level of curiosity inside you. So you know the reason why your moods are the way they are, the feelings are the way they are. The second part of being acutely self-aware is self-mastery. So whatever it is that's mastering you in any given moment, then find out how you can master yourself in that moment. Let me say that again. Find how you can master yourself in that moment. So don't let someone else or something else master you. So don't lose it, control it. So feelings do not rule you. So find how you can master the feelings that you're experiencing. So ignite that curiosity so that you actually understand what ignites some of these feelings and moods and emotions, and the lack of when you want to do something. The second one is all to do with regulation. So regulation is all about controlling something and redirecting something. So this is where you want to teach your brain some new things. So the only way you can teach it is by learning. So if you want to prevent early onset of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, even things like stroke, and now we're learning that the heart also has a learning center. So the way to deal with all of these, avoid all of these things, is to learn. So learn about your own thoughts, learn about the impulses that cause you to do something, or that split-second decision of not to do something when you know you should. And also regulate your mood and your behavior. So the second part is all about learning. And by the way, your brain loves to learn. And the more you learn, the more you keep all those other things that I mentioned at bay. So instead of hearing about early onset of dementia, for example, say to yourself, I'm going to regulate how I learn and how much I learn. So the way to do that is to proactively implement a self-redirective process. In other words, say to yourself, oh my gosh, my thoughts are really negative about this situation, this person. So as soon as you're aware of that, which is what we talked about, self-awareness, you regulate it by saying, I will implement a different process. I will think a different thought. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is change your cognitive behaviors. In other words, the things that you think about often, like on repeat, for example, if those same thoughts are repeating over and over again, or those same behaviors are repeating over and over again, then say to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm getting stuck in a rut. So how can I change that? Number three is monitor your emotional self-awareness. So don't let someone else or something else control your emotional mood. So monitor it, be aware what's causing it. And as I said, it's the ability to proactively monitor, to change and implement something in any given moment. And your brain, by the way, would love this challenge. If you give it the challenge, it would love to do it because it loves to learn something new. So the secret is, the more you practice this, the more you will achieve. Okay, so it's simple as that. It's nothing greater than that. The more you practice this, the more you will achieve it. So number three, I told you there were five. So number three is motivation. So motivation is all about transformation. So the key here is find that passion to get those things done, not for money or for status, but the fact is that you just want to get it done. So go to one of those 4 quadrants I talked to you about earlier and say, how can I complete this quadrant, this one quadrant, by this afternoon, by tomorrow, by the end of the week. So set yourself a motivational challenge and see if you can achieve that. So one of the ways to do that is to find optimism in the face of failure. So instead of your mind saying, I can't do it, say to yourself, I can do it. So commit and move forward, and don't change your mind once you make a commitment. Go for it. No matter how small it is, go forward. Don't let yourself go back, because your brain, if you go back, your brain will use that as an excuse to stop you every single time. The third part of getting things done in terms of that motivation is progress. So track it, measure it, achieve it, and celebrate it. Open that special bottle of wine or champagne you've been saving up because you've achieved something amazing. So track it, measure it, achieve it, and celebrate it. And that's the key to progress. So that's motivation. So go up and never stop is the whole idea of motivation. So anytime your brain says, I can't, say to yourself, I can, and here is my first step. And just go and move that piece of paper or move that one thing that you know that you should move or change. So we talked about self-awareness, self-regulation, inner motivation. The number 4 is empathy. So we've all heard of this word, and if we had time, I'd go into the deeper aspects of empathy. But let me just say very briefly that you want to develop the advanced skill of understanding others, treating their emotions, not yours, but treating their emotions with kindness, and develop the empathy skills in others. Develop the empathy skills in others. So teach it, transfer it, show people the way, give them an alternative. Even if they don't receive it, the idea is just to plant the seed. So empathy is also developing the art of showing a level of compassion. So it's about the heart and the mind coming together in terms of empathy. And the last one is social expertise with all. So we talked about building relationships. Another challenge which post-pandemic will be how to develop rapport with people you don't really would engage with. So this is really good for the brain to understand how to do that. Finding common ground with others and enlarging that common ground is another way for the brain to grow. Allowing others to shine without judgment. That's a very key aspect to your social expertise, because most of the time the brain will say, what about me? You never asked about me. I've been through that as well. So those thoughts show that you're not being an expert in terms of this particular skill. And the last aspect is collaborate. So for the first time, this particular pandemic has showed us that we can work together no matter what. And so we need to find and collaborate. So don't be an island. And the idea is whatever it is you're finding a challenge with, learn to collaborate. So build the relationships, develop some rapport, find some common ground, and start to work together to achieve whatever it is you need to achieve. So collaboration, one of my favorite authors has said this. Peter Senge said, collaboration is vital to sustain what we call profound or really deep change. Because without that really deep change, us and organizations are just overwhelmed by the forces of the status quo. So I love that, because we can't move forward this particular decade unless we learn to collaborate, or else we're going to reinvent the same thing over and over and over again. So in summary, I talked about self-awareness, self-regulation, inner motivation, empathy, and social expertise with all. And if you have achieved all of these, then you have achieved the neuroscience of emotional intelligence. So if you hear anyone talking about emotional intelligence, immediately stop and say to yourself, I wonder if they display all 5 of these elements. Because if they don't, they are kidding themselves and they're also kidding you. So in conclusion, create some time while we have this pandemic, because you'll never find the time. You need to create it. So don't ever let your mind say to yourself, I've got to find the time. And don't ever say to yourself, I don't have the time. Because the idea is that the mind will rob you of the time that you have. So work on creating time. Number 2, do not focus on perfection. Focus on consistency, okay? Perfection is the enemy of consistency. Anyone who's a perfectionist, I always run 100 miles from them because I know they'll never be consistent. So don't do a one-off, be consistent so that your brain learns the idea of mastery. Number 3, master one big thing rather than dabbling in many things. So the brain loves to know that it can master something, but if it dabbles in many things, usually it never completes them. So completion is very, very important for the brain because it realizes, oh, I've achieved, and let me move on to the next big thing. Number 4, address the common blocks, the things that we use as excuses and reasons. So post-COVID-19, get rid of the common blocks, because those blocks are the things that will keep you chained and locked up and blocked up deep within you. And the last part is do each part of each thing slowly with joy. Yes, with absolute joy. Even the things that you don't like, do each part of each thing slowly with joy. So find joy in the things, in the smallest things that you do not like. Have a good laugh at yourself. Have a good laugh at the fact that you don't like doing it, but enjoy doing it anyway. So every failure, every adversity, every heartache carries with it a seed of equal or greater benefit. So whatever the challenges that you're facing, just remember that if you approach it with these 4 tools, which is ignite your curiosity, learn about that situation, learn about yourself, transform your mind, and collaborate, amazing, amazing things are going to happen. So thank you so much for coming and listening to this. I hope you've learned just one thing out of this presentation. And I want to close with perseverance means succeeding because you're determined to, not because you're destined to. You're going to succeed because you're determined to, not because you're destined to. So I'm going to hand over back to Gina.
Okay, I've unmuted me and we got the screen back. Thank you, David. There's a lot there. Practical things for us to do. Let's see if anybody has any questions. I think somewhere in there you talked about at some point you talked about stepping forward as a leader, because interestingly, as we're entering this new normal where things are being changed, and there isn't a plan, there isn't a map. It's interesting, individuals moving forward. I'm giving an example which the UK people might know here. As a footballer stepped forward and talked about, you know, if the government plans this summer for kids excludes certain other kids, they won't have any food. So he really lobbied for a turnaround in the policy on free school meals or free meals for all children or some children. And I don't know, it was 24 or 48 hours later, through his campaign that the media took up, you know, the government change was there. So I think we are individually, aren't we? We're going to have to take on, I think you talked earlier about take on the mantle of being a leader rather than wait for our leaders, that we don't necessarily respect all of them. And on the chat, people were saying Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, because I don't know whether it's because she's part of the Commonwealth, New Zealand, but we've had a lot of media here highlighting that the leaders who have done well, Iceland, female prime minister, Germany, female prime minister, and New Zealand the same, they are examples of a different kind of leadership. I don't know if there are any other female leaders that I can't think of, but they're the countries that have done well the pandemic. I know what's happening in Iceland because I know Runa in Iceland, and she lets me know, and you know they're kind of clear now. So it's interesting, isn't it? If we don't have great leaders to get behind, then we've got to say, well, where can I lead? I don't know if you want to make a comment on that. You are unmuted, aren't you? Oh, you mean, okay, leave yourself unmuted, yeah.
So a good example of that is the fact that Black Lives Matter, for example, where leaders have been asked probably for decades, if not centuries in some cases, to consider what they're doing regarding policy, regarding legislation, lead by example, lead with a new way of approaching this age-old problem. But in the absence of that, people then took a kind of leadership by crowds, if you like, and did something about it. And it's interesting in terms of the news analysis about that particular issue. So forget the fact that it's Black Lives Matter, just the issue itself as a whole. Very few leaders actually have addressed the issue on a positive way. In other words, here was a great opportunity for them to rise up and say, let's change this. Let's transform this. Let's do something in a collaborative space. But very few have had the courage to get up and do that. And therefore, people have had to take the actions that they did. Right or wrong, good or bad, is not the issue. The fact is, it was a leadership opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's so many areas where it calls us to be vocal. I mean, marching was one thing, but I think I gave you the other day the example that if anybody has seen the Netflix drama, The Crown, and has seen the episode where the Queen, I think in 1963, if those are old enough to remember, there was a disaster called the Aberfan disaster, when a school was completely overwhelmed by the pit slurry, and 160 lives lost, children's lives. It was an absolute disaster. And in the dramatization that was on The Crown, the Queen's reaction, Queen and the Prime Minister talking, Harold Wilson, the Queen's reaction was, we don't do disasters, we go to churches and we do celebrations. It was like that was the Crown's leadership, that was the leadership she was following. And Harold Wilson, who was a socialist Labour leader, taken over from a long period of establishment leadership, was like, well, this doesn't feel right. You know, we've got to be with the people. And he, in the drama, it was showing how the Socialist Party, the Labour Party, were going to have to take the fall for all the errors of the capitalist regime, as it were. And he was calling for a change. And in the end, the Queen capitulated. And at the end of the programme, it said it was the one regret the Queen had, that she didn't act faster and go there. So I don't know if everybody's seen it, but it's like there's an established leadership, and you can see how leaders can get trapped in a way of working, and something new is called for, and it does call for that courage, doesn't it, to step out and be human, bring our empathy to a situation and do what nobody's done before. And I think we've seen that with leaders. I remember seeing that in Australia, where there were massive floods, and a new kind of leader seemed to step out of the same political conversations to take charge of the drama. So when we have a crisis or a drama, I think there's the opportunity to either be really great, and step up, or to get caught in an old leadership narrative and then not know what to do. And maybe a lot of our leaders have been caught in old narratives and don't know what to do in the new situation. They don't have the confidence, or they're not tuning into their hearts. I don't know.
We have to get rid of this notion that leaders or a leader has all the answers. That is such an old paradigm, because one person does not have all the answers, and therefore it is just so critical that we collaborate, because two brains, all of us sitting here today, we make a much better collective with our ideas working together than one person saying, I've got the answer. And this is the 2020s, and I think we need to work together. We can't get off this planet, unfortunately. And I just looked up the other day that the nearest habitable planet, if it is habitable, is about 1.7 million years of travel away. So unless we're willing to travel that far, we can't get off this planet. And therefore, we need to think about leadership in a completely different way. So this notion of leaders saying this is the way to do things is actually false. And we need to say to each other, what can we do? How can we do it differently? And I think that's the important thing right now. And this pandemic, the only reason it's worked is because we collaborated. The leaders didn't. And have a look at the fun that we're going to have after the pandemic, because as travel restrictions come down, have a look at the fun that what each country is going to do. Instead of collaborating, everyone's going to say, well, if you're going to land in my space, you've got to pay more landing rights, landing fees, because we don't have as many cases as you do, for example. So we're actually, I hope you all will have a good laugh as you see leaders jockeying for that slightly higher ground, if you like, as opposed to collaborating with each other. So the number of, I was going to say, the number of questions on chat, so I was wondering if we should take those.
Just looking here. Somebody was making a comment about I can't make the distinction between comments and questions. Do you think some organisation steps up in the vacuum of country leadership? Is that a question?
Yeah, Desley asked a good question. So yes, absolutely. That's because in the absence of any kind of knowledge or wisdom, people have to step in. And one of the things I'd like to share with you all, and that is this, and that is those who manage will always give you knowledge, but those who lead will always share their wisdom. So keep that in mind.
Can you repeat that, David? It sounds like a soundbite. Can you repeat that?
Those who manage will always give you their knowledge. This is the way to do it. That's not the way to do it. They will always tell you what they know. And that's not a good way to lead or change anybody. But a true leader will share their wisdom. So if you think about your own life, have a look at those who inspired you the most. It's those who shared their wisdom. Whereas all those who told you that's not the way to do it, or this is the way to do it, you always got irritated with them because they're trying to manage you. So that is very important in terms of how you see leaders.
I was just going to flag up that as we're talking about new kinds of leadership and what it calls us to do and ask of other people or ask of ourselves, I'm called to mind the ability to change your mind. It seems to be something about dominant leadership, as Rianne Eisler talks, the difference between partnership and domination, the two cultural ways of that spectrum of running things. And where we have this more masculine, patriarchal, egoic leadership style, it's very difficult to backtrack and say, I was wrong, I'm going to change it. And the media, pour down on people who change their minds. In fact, I think in my head, I can hear, what did they say about Hillary Clinton? Called her flip-flop because she would go back. But isn't that what's needed to say, I was wrong? I've now got more data, I've examined it further, and I think we need to change. Just like I gave the example of the government pulling back this week quickly on a decision because a campaign was put in place, we do have to have the ability to say, I can change my mind. Leaders do that, don't they? I mean, that's the new kind of leadership, to say, I was wrong about that, and I am human enough or humble enough to say, I got it wrong. We need to give people space to do that, don't we?
Absolutely. And remember that those who say, I'm sorry I was wrong, or I did not make the right choice, or I didn't make the right decision, remember the 4 things I talked about, and that is, the first one was ignite. So ignite the curiosity. The reason why Donald Trump is so bad as a leader, the number one thing about him is that he has no curiosity to learn. That's what makes him so bad. Nothing else. He's got no curiosity to learn about something new or different. So the point that you made was a good leader needs to say, I made a wrong choice, or I'm sorry I did that or said that. And therefore learn from that particular instance, learn from that particular mistake. But the third thing is transforming. In other words, don't repeat the same mistake, because what the brain does is, if you keep repeating the same mistake, is that it anchors it into your brain, and you will keep repeating that mistake over and over and over again. So you'll feel the same anger with the same person. You'll feel the same frustration about the same situation. And I might take you and put you in a different job, a different country, a different home, a different neighborhood, but you'll experience the same thing because the brain is locked into those particular pathways. So the idea is, the moment something is not right or you did something wrong, just remember, the brain just made an excuse in that moment. So just immediately correct it, change it. Otherwise, it takes a long while. In some cases, it takes decades to unravel that particular neural pathway. And you will hear people who say, look, I haven't spoken to that person for 30 years or 40 years because they could not admit what they did. So when you talked about what do we need to do, we need to say to ourselves, I need to learn from this situation. Otherwise, I get locked into my previous behavior. And that's what causes Alzheimer's. That's what causes dementia, is because we are not willing to break or change the pattern.
So what you're saying is, when we engage with the news about what's coming in now, rather than go, oh my God, shut down, I mean, and there's only so much of the news around that we can take, is to engage with it in an inquiry way, because that is what's going to help our brains keep adapting to the change, because we're going to be growing and think, well, I wonder if they go this way. I mean, I'm listening to the schools, and somewhere I heard a comment about, why is it we send have the children sit in a class all day to listen to a teacher, and then they go home with homework and there's nobody around to supervise. The adults, don't know the answers to the problems. There's no teacher there. Why don't we change it around and have the children do the homework in school? and then go home and then use that time to be one-on-one on Zoom, on a computer, teaching that way. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So, you know, if we can move out, if we can be creative all the time in this, then our brains are kind of rewiring themselves, aren't they? And finding those new solutions rather than just going, oh no. David, I've seen there's a comment here from Caroline. She's asking, she said, I've just taught a class on the force of habit and how attempts to change can create inner conflict. It seems to me that what you say about collaboration could be really useful in helping us to recognize and change our own unconscious habits. And what would be your view?
So I'm not sure I can answer your question in a simple way, Caroline, but let me give it a go. So the idea is habits are beyond what's called the neocortex. They actually happen in a different part of the brain. In other words, you are so unconscious about that particular habit that you are not aware. And one of the things I talked about is self-awareness. So when it happens on what's called that autopilot, if you like, the brain basically is in cruise control. In other words, imagine you're on a freeway, you're driving, and you put your car in cruise control. You don't have to do any thinking. The car maintains its speed. It maintains a safe distance between you and the other car. And basically, you can pretty much look around, if you like, and drive fairly safely. So you're in cruise control. So the brain loves any habit, because it's on that auto cruise control. And the danger of being on auto cruise control is that it prevents two things. Number one, it will keep you in the box and it will never allow you to be creative. So that is really dangerous for your mental health. And secondly, it will never seek a different solution, an innovative solution to something that it does on autopilot. Those two are the biggest kind of early causes of dementia. So we used to see dementia in people who are in their late 80s, 90s. Now we're seeing it in people who are in their 30s and 40s because they are repeating the same thing over and over and over again. So you're absolutely right, Caroline, in terms of it is subconscious, but also, or unconscious, but also more importantly, you need to bring the habit to your awareness zone so that you're actually aware that you're actually doing it. So for example, if any one of you have honest, good friends, ask them to observe a habit of yours. Ask them to say, what is one thing that you see that I do often? And see what they have to say. Just say one, don't ask them for 10 because you'll get upset. Just say, tell me one thing that you think that I do often that irritates you. And you'll be surprised at what they pick up and what you're unaware of. But it's a great exercise because it's not for their benefit, it's for yours. And go, wonder when I did that, is usually the next question that comes to your brain is, I never did that, but the curious question is, when do I do that? So yeah, great question.
You're inviting people to do a personal 360 there, aren't you?
Yeah, in a way it is. But it's great because you want to bring the unconscious to the conscious awareness so you can master it as opposed to keep repeating it.
We're coming up to 12:30. There's one last comment question here from Sarah about education. Looking, it's a long one here. I can't see where the question is. Can you read it, David?
Wow, okay.
Through first-hand experience, curious. Even education has moved to a narrow approach of throwing knowledge into a human and then assessing against the criteria whether that human knows it, which means that you simply test whether the teacher taught you well and you have the knowledge. Education to be about teaching how to learn. Absolutely. Is this likely to occur? Probably not. Yeah. Yeah, it's
brilliant.
education.
Sarah, brilliant. A very, very good question. Is this likely to occur? Do we put our calendars away and
It's up to
bring some
you.
other time piece out? You know what? Being a teacher myself, I know how you feel and what you're actually saying, but more importantly, I say rather than waiting for the governments to make that change, I try and make it in the classroom myself. So my greatest joy is to teach people how to learn or how to be curious, rather than waiting for, you know, the boss and the principal and all the higher ups to tell me, how do I do this? So to me, it's all about every day meeting with family or friends, all the social acquaintances. I try and at least find a way to leave them with one thing, and that is, can I inspire them to learn, or can I inspire them to be curious about something? So if they're asking questions, at least that's the door that's opening to that curiosity to learn. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but it's more likely I think it's a very difficult space education is in. I can't wait for the day when we have 3D. So in other words, all of you would be appearing right in front of me as if you're real as holograms. That's when I know that education will have lost that power over the fact that you need to be in the classroom and you need to listen to me. And I'm the one who's going to stimulate your learning. So I think it's a ways to go yet.
David, you are really speaking about the shift in an education system that trains people to get a job and works in a factory style production economy, because we are in a production wealth economy, versus creating individuals who have enhanced capacities and more self-directed, and living a more balanced life. And that's a big system shift, because then, yes, you would change the education system, and that makes a society more, under the current way, more difficult to control, doesn't it? It's more difficult to control people if everybody has total freedom of thoughts and enhanced capacities. You're a lot harder to rule, if I may say so, in this space.
So we need to move our mindset from control to collaboration.
Yeah.
So each one of you, if we're in a room together, all of you would have an impact on my behavior. So we're collaborating on the way I would behave, as opposed to, you know, because you're not here, you don't have that direct impact, for example. But as we move down this decade, unless we collaborate, it's going to be about control.
We've had some nice comments from people. So when I send out the recording of this, as I will do today, people will be able to review this again if they choose to, but they'll be able to see all the comments and we can have a look. So as we come to the end now, I would invite you to make comments in public spaces where Conscious Cafe is, you know, on our Facebook page. If you've enjoyed today, we have consciouscafe.org as the place to go if you're not in a Conscious Cafe community and want to seek out a meeting near you. We do have our global Zoom next week, which is going to be with Wendy on next Wednesday, the 24th. So that's coming up next week when we'll all meet again in this space. So David, I want to say a massive thank you. Thank you for all of that. I'm going to unmute all, and everybody can go woohoo, away, or wave, or whatever.
Well, before you do, let me just say there are a number of people who've actually made some beautiful comments, and I didn't get to say a personal thank you to each one of you, but thank you so much. That is very kind of you that you took the time to write those wonderful words. So it means a lot to me. So thank you very much.
It's David, I'm so grateful. Thank you. I don't know what time it is in your evening, but thank you for spending your evening with us here in Europe, well, in the morning, lunchtime. And we look forward to meeting you again. And anybody who didn't get to see it is going to watch it on our recording. Thank you for all of us at Conscious Cafe.
Thank you.
I'm doing the unmute now. Unmute all. Everyone then can go woohoo.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for raising the ideas.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Inspiring, very inspiring.